Hello, I go by Remy or Voime, and I'm going to be showing you the processes and techniques and everything I did to make Raora Panthera of HoloLive English's jabot pin torque necklace, I believe you could call this thing. But yeah, we're going to be going over some resin work for creating the gemstone, creating the collar itself, as well as the lace work we've attached to it. So let's get started. So typically the first step for 3D printing is to have a 3D model to print. So I did create the 3D model for this necklace. I have a link in the video description to where you can download it for free. If you feel so inclined to make one of these yourself. But as far as teaching you how to 3D model goes, that's an entire course worth of education that I currently have not created videos for. Maybe by the time you watch this I have. I'll edit that into the video description if I have, but if there's no link to some playlist or video or something talking about how I 3D model there, the resources are online. You can teach yourself this. It's how I taught myself it. The program I'm using is Fusion 360. I'm more comfortable with engineering CADs than a 3D modeling program like Blender. So that's just what I use because it's what I'm used to, but you can use Blender if you'd rather learn that tool set. Now on to the 3D printing. So with my 3D printer, the only issue I typically run into so far is bed adhesion issues, which will often be the prints sticking to the PTFE film in the resin vat rather than the build plate itself. And what I do that seems to work pretty darn well for me so far is to take some PTFE based dry lube and just put a nice light coating of this on the PTFE film. And then let this sit for like 10 minutes until it dries, and then usually that's good enough to fix my bed adhesion issues. So something some people relatively new to resin printing underestimate is the importance of resin or material choice. So for what we're printing out now, it's got some relatively fine spindly elements. So you're gonna have to pick a resin that is more ductile or flexible, because if you try and use a base resin, that thing's gonna snap. So for most cosplay props in general, since surviving an entire con day can be relatively strenuous on the props, and that's why people like using materials like foam that are pretty flexible, I've been getting pretty darn good results out of ABS like resins. They tend to flex pretty darn far before they break. So once your printer is done printing out, it is time to clean off the parts, because since the parts were lifted up out of a vat of resin, there's still going to be a layer of uncured resin on your parts, and depending on what effect you're going for, you may want to get that layer of resin off before it cures on and distorts your model from what you expected to print. So to do that, you would want to wash your parts off with say a high percentage isopropyl solution. You're supposed to use 99%. I'm using 91%. When you're working with uncured resin, you want gloves and a respirator. You don't want to get the stuff on your skin, and you don't want to breathe it in. Be careful when removing your parts, they may drip a little bit. I just let it sit like that for a little while until it's all dry and the alcohol's evaporated away. Now keep in mind there will be a lot of alcohol and resin fumes in this process, so be sure to wear a respirator, do this outside, whatever prevents you from breathing this stuff in. You don't want it in your lungs. So now that our prints have been rinsed out of the So now that the excess resin has been rinsed off of our prints, you can go ahead and get them off the build plate. And for this, you're just going to want to get some sort of flat spatula, and you're just going to want to scrape it off. Now, while you do this, you're going to want to be careful to not fling your print. You're going to be careful to not want to like stab it like I just did, or just flip around. So just be gentle, just work your way around, and don't bend anything too much. So like for something like this, switch over to the other side so that you're not just wedging it too far. And normally it'll come off your print bed pretty darn quick. Oh wow, this actually will fit into my cure station, so I don't need to separate it up. So the sun does cure it. So if you live in a sunny area, you can honestly just leave most of your prints outside instead of using one of these cure stations. But it's getting a little late, the sun's not super strong, so I'm just using my cure station for this one. Once your parts have gone through their final cure phase, there shouldn't be any resin residue still on them. They shouldn't be sticky anymore, and you should be able to handle them with your bare hands. If for some reason they're still sticky or there's still residue on it, wipe it down with some sort of cloth with alcohol on it, or cure it for longer. So we're going to be doing the fun part now, which is removing the supports from these pieces. Your splicing software may want to put just a ton of supports all over these things, but really don't have to. If you didn't go too crazy with the supports, you can probably take them off relatively easily. Depending on your material and your printer, sometimes the supports are pretty darn easy to remove, but they often can make a little bit of a mess too. So be careful when you're doing this, because you don't want to, like, especially these little arms here are pretty darn brittle, so you definitely want to be careful when you're peeling the supports off. You don't want to snap or bend anything. So we're going to trim this back about as close as we can get it. You can use nippers for this, or sometimes what actually works really well is some needle nose pliers. Sometimes if you use needle nose pliers, you can really snap things off closer to it, because like the nippers will cut the supports, but sometimes if you grab the supports and flex them off, since they usually taper into the material, sometimes they will naturally snap at the material, so you can get a cleaner break closer to the material with needle noses rather than nippers. But it totally depends on parts, geometry, how you've set up your supports and all that kind of stuff. And after you get that the supports off of it, you should be left with pretty close to what you want. You'll probably still feel some supports on there, since this part is going to sit on the neck. I definitely want to get all of these little nubs off. You can't really, you can kind of see them, but with this material resin that we use, resin usually sands pretty darn easy. So we can go over to get some sandpaper out and smooth this off. All right, we've got our sanding bucket and we're ready to do some wet sanding on our resin to get off the little bit that's left from, removing the supports. So some people say that you don't need to wear a dust mask when wet sanding, because you're wet sanding it and the water's going to catch all the particles and weigh them down. I'm going to wear a dust mask anyway, because I'm not going to be spending a whole lot of time sanding it, and my lungs are pretty important to me. I prefer to keep them safe. Now, as far as wearing gloves go, though, I don't wear gloves while sanding resin, because it's cured. Once resin's cured, it's pretty innocuous stuff. So you can certainly wear gloves if you want. I won't make fun of you. So I am just using 180 grit sandpaper for the finish that I'm doing. It actually is kind of helpful to sand them, but this removes the nubs pretty darn fast off of this resin. So, common sanding question is, how do you know when you're done sanding? And the answer to that is, you're done sanding when you're done. I know that sounds silly, but you need to have your goal in mind and what you're trying to accomplish. We're not going for a mirror finish. We're just going for not being able to feel those little bumps anymore from removing the supports. So when I can't feel the bumps anymore, I'm done. If you're working on a much more intense sanding process, like trying to get a mirror finish out of whatever you're working on, then as you step through your sandpaper grits, you just gotta stop and take a look and say, are all the bigger scratches gone and replaced with smaller scratches? If not, well, you sand until you're done. So now this piece is done. Now for larger flat pieces like this, I'll dip it in water, get it nice and wet, and then I will take my sandpaper, find a nice flat portion of it, and then I will lay it down on something flat like this. I think this is a piece of MDF, but if you have curved areas, you can overlap them over the edge, but you just hold it down flat on the sandpaper and just move it around. So as you may or may not be able to see along the edges here, the resin didn't print perfectly flat, so there's still the slightest little bit of roughness around the edges I don't want. So as a little pro tip, something that can really help you get in some of the harder to reach areas when sanding resin can be a nice sanding block. It's a sanding sponge. And that can really be great for getting around those corners. Wanted a little bit more durability on the joints of where the arms meet the main, I guess I'll call it a pendant. So part of the design was some little channels to add in about 0.4 inches of, what is this, 16 gauge craft wire. So something to keep in mind when gluing things like this craft wire is glue typically needs a rough surface to grip onto, and this is some pretty polished shiny stuff, so the glue's not really going to grip onto that. So you can roughen up these surfaces in a few ways, just giving the glue something to grab onto. So I'm going to use the nippers, not cut all the way through the material, but cut into it just a little bit. You can see there are some nice little grooves for the glue to grab onto. And then once you have added your little extension into the arm, you want to pack that in there real good. Oh, also, you probably want to use your pliers to make it as flat and straight as possible. But you can see here the little extended bit will just help join the two parts. When you go to glue them, it'll help hold them together for you, and it'll add some more stability to the joint so it won't break off quite as easily when you glue it on later. Typically you'll need to add some dimension to parts where you glue resin bits together. You'll need some sort of stable rod going through it, because if you just try and glue two flat pieces together, they're going to snap off pretty easily. But if you add a little bit of a stabilizer in the middle, it'll hold up pretty darn well most of the time. Alright, so it is time for the inevitable phase of any and every crafting project where we use a popsicle stick for something. So we're going to do an all-over paint on this. There's not going to be anywhere for us to really hold on to the model very well while we're coating it in our extra coatings and paint and all the processes I'm going to show you up next. So we're going to need to give ourselves some sort of a handle. Now, my typical method is to use a popsicle stick or something and hot glue it onto the model. The reason why I use hot glue is because except for areas of resin that are very thin, most of the time you can heat up you can heat up resin enough to get hot glue off of it without distorting the resin. If you're not careful, when you heat up the resin, you can melt it, but typically you'll be able to get it hot enough to get the hot glue off without disturbing the resin. But hot glue has a pretty solid grip on resin, so it gives you this really nice bond that is very strong. However, it's still removable, but the process you use to remove it is definitely not something that you can do accidentally. So typically will hold as long as you want it to, but you can get it to let go later. So that's why I've added this little T in here on the model that we'll remove later. But I'm just gonna add some hot glue onto this T. Push the popsicle stick down. Make sure there's plenty of hot glue to get stuck on there. And then you're just gonna wanna hold it for maybe a couple minutes until the hot glue cools off and you get a nice solid grip. So note two things. First of all, if you end up doing a hot glue project that leaves a lot of strings, you can pretty easily clean them up with a lint roller. That can help out sometimes. And the hot glue there is a little bit of a trick to it. Once you first apply the hot glue and it's still like pretty hot and really liquid, and you stick the popsicle stick on, you want to make sure that it doesn't move around. There's kind of like a phase while it's cooling off where if the popsicle stick moves, it won't bond. So it's like when you first apply the glue and it's really hot, it's gonna get like that nice mental ward grippy you're going for. But if you don't hold it still during the cooling process and the popsicle stick moves around a little bit, it's not gonna keep that hold, so you gotta hold it steady until it fully cools. I had the popsicle stick pointing more forward, but kind of got in the way of the little arms that we're gonna be gluing on. So I moved the popsicle stick to point more downward. So for gluing our arms onto the pendant, I'm actually gonna be using XTC 3D. Now I find that this stuff works really good as an epoxy sealant or gluing stuff together. I think it works way better than super glue. It also maintains a nice bit of flex so it doesn't tend to break off. And the other thing too is since it's also the self-leveling coating, it also will do a pretty good job of filling seams in as you go. So I'm gonna go ahead and follow the instructions for mixing this, which is using 2 parts of the bigger bottle, mixing it with 1 part of the smaller bottle, and then I'm gonna just use that like a glue for getting these arms on there. So after you've glued whatever parts of your model need to be glued on, you can just go ahead and do the coating step that I'm going to show you immediately after this. However, sometimes I will give it a light wet sand with 600 grit. To be honest, I don't really notice a difference between the coating I'm going to give it whether or not I sand it, but sometimes I'll sand it anyway if I just feel like wanting to make sure things come out right, because theoretically roughing up the surface a little bit should help the coating. So for the gold coating, you got to be careful about how you do this since you're making jewelry, or since we're making jewelry here. You have to have a pretty darn solid coat that's going to hold up through just a lot of rubbing. Because you wear jewelry, it's going to rub on your clothes, it's going to rub on your skin. Most coatings will rub out. So I have a coating here that will not. I know electroplating is very popular. I will not be showing you electroplating because that's a lot of setup I have not done yet. So I'm going to show you an alternative to that. We are going to be using mica powders mixed into XTC 3D. So the ratios here are really the important part, and also the layering. So the first base layer, we're going to be using a golden mica powder, not a metallic powder, a mica powder for a darker gold color. And the reason why we're doing that is because mica powder, it spreads a lot more evenly than the actual metallic powder. So the metallic powder will get you this real nice gold part here. The golden mica powder will get you, it's nice, but it's really not gold. It looks kind of like fake gold. But the metallic powder, it'll get you like a real golden look. It's kind of chunkier than mica powder. At least in my case, there might be better powders that I haven't found yet, so you can try experimenting with that. But this metallic powder doesn't spread fully evenly. There will be little gaps between it that you can notice, and it will also build up a rough texture. So as you put on multiple layers, it'll just get nasty feeling and just kind of like have a rough texture that you don't want a polished gold finish to have. So we'll be adding the mica powder as a base layer, and then once that gets built up to a nice full coverage, you can top coat it with one layer of the gilded gold, and then you can put on a clear coat on top of it. So we're just going to be building up layers, and that's going to get us a nice, very sturdy, this is not going to rub off because it's an epoxy coat, but you'll get a nice, very sturdy, very golden look without having to go through all the hassle and expense of an electroplating setup. So the ratios that are the important part is 1 part part A by volume to 1 part powder. Actually, sorry. So 2 parts part A, 2 parts mica powder, 1 part part B. So for instance, I'm using measuring cups. The smallest bit on the measuring cup is 2.5 milliliters. So I'll be filling the measuring cup up to the 2.5 milliliter line with the mica powder or the metallic powder, depending on which coating we're on. Then I'll have another cup that I fill up to the 2.5 milliliter line with part A. Then I will mix those two together for a minute. So I'll have a mixture of the part A and the mica powder. And then I will put in half of however much mica powder or part A of part B. So if I've got 2.5 milliliters of part A, I'll be putting in 1.75 milliliters of part B. So I actually just cut a measuring cup in half. So that's the ratios you need to mix these at. And the closer you get the mixtures, the better. You really want to have pretty darn close to the same amount of volume of powder and part A. So we're going to go ahead and mix those up. Alright, once you've got it mixed, it's time to apply it to your part. To do this, you're going to want to use a foam brush. A normal bristle brush will usually get some brush line. So the main thing to keep in mind with this stuff is you need very, very thin coats. We're talking like, it's not like you're spreading this stuff on, it's more like you spilled some on and you're trying to get it off. So that's like how thin you want this stuff on here. So for some of these more spindly stuff, you know, honestly, I'm gonna need to grab it further down. Should have done this before, you know, sticking my glove in a bunch of XTC painted on, but oh well. So at first it'll go on pretty thin. As this stuff hardens up, which will happen pretty quickly, it'll start to give you a more thick coat. So we'll probably be going back over this later once our mixture thickens up a bit anyway, but we'll just want to get a nice even coating across the part. So just pay close attention to it as you go. You want to make sure that you smooth out any buildups or droplets, because they will maybe dry like that. Stuff's pretty good at self-leveling as long as you get it close, but if you leave any big drops, they're gonna dry like that. Especially if you put on too thick of a coat, you'll get some pooling and some drops too. So it's basically just trying to spread out to even its surface level. So if you've just got a ton of stuff on there, you're not gonna get a flat surface. So you've got to pay attention to the viscosity of this stuff as you go. If you keep trying to spread it when it gets too thick, it's going to be pulling chunks of your brush off into your part. So you definitely want to, you know, not be still trying to spread it when that happens, and when it gets too thick to spread anymore. I've never encountered issues of a new coat of XTC not congealing pretty well with the previous one, so you should be able to just mix up another coat and get right back to painting. If you're noticing buildup in corners that are difficult to get your brush into, you can flatten those out with a pin. And when your stuff is gummed up a bit too much to still spread it around, go ahead and give it a critical eye. Look for any darker areas and smooth those out, because you're going to want a nice smooth finish. So this batch has hardened too much to continue spreading. This got enough of the part done, so I am not going to mix up another batch just yet. I will wait, I'd say another hour, and then this isn't quite as thick of a coat. Well, I'll see how it looks in like an hour and decide whether I want to do another coat of the mica gold or move on to the metallic pigment powder gold. But the way I hold my parts for them to dry is I just have a box of sand and I just stick the popsicle stick in it. And I'll leave that there for about an hour. So I've got a second coat on here and it's looking pretty nice and even. If you get to this point with your second coat of like the mica powder gold and you're sitting back thinking, yeah, this is it, you can just stop here, let it dry for a good day or so and call it a day and be done with it. I want, you know, the little more metallic look that I get out of the gold coat, so I'll be doing the metallic powder next. But yeah, you can just stop here if you want. The metallic gold looks very nice when mixed with the part A, but you can tell it's a lot thicker than the mica powder. So the metallic gold powder goes on a little thick, so I recommend really taking a good look, making sure you've got all the corners smoothed out, got a nice even coating. Make sure it looks good, because once this stuff dries, that's it. That's what it's gonna look like. You can't sand this stuff to smooth it off, so you gotta make sure you do a good job while you're spreading it. So the next step is to create our little gemstone with the chitini in it. So I created sort of a gemstone cut finish on top here, which was just done with some extrudes and some lofts to create the triangles. And then for the chitini itself, created a little 2D sketch and then did some extrudes off of the sketch to get us some different layers here at different heights for what colors. So each one of these layers is going to be a different layer of colored resin, and building that up is how we're going to get our chitini in the gemstone. If you don't understand that right now, that's okay. I will show you it. You'll understand by the end of the video. And then there will be a little bit of a pool in the overall gemstone itself so that we can fill it up with some color. And then we're going to 3D print this out in clear resin. Now back in our slicing software, import the chitini gemstone that we're going to be printing out. You might be tempted to want to print it out flat for quicker print time, but resin print, the clear resin I've been using kind of gums up a bit, so I recommend printing it in a way that it's going to be able to drain the best. Also, you don't want to be picking supports out of the chitini, so I found that it's best to just let it take a little bit longer to print and print in this orientation. And I also find that if you want to like really keep the gemstone cuts, you probably have to back your supports off from the gemstone itself. Actually, the automatic supports so it lifts it up off and all that stuff. So I wanted to do the automatic supports so that it lifts it up. I'm going to remove all supports and then just do the manual editing. And honestly, I don't find that I really need that many supports on some of my prints. So I'm just gonna put the supports on the flat parts so that I can remove them later. And that should be enough supports for it. And then we're ready to send this over to the printer and print this out on some clear resin. Now it's time for possibly my least favorite part of the entire process, which is going to be cleaning out the resin out of the resin tray. It's just kind of an annoying process because it's messy. I have to do it inside so the sun doesn't bake the resin on somewhere, and then I have to like fumigate my room to get all the, well, this room of my house, to get all the resin vapors out of here. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be removing the tray. We're going to be pouring the tray through a paint strainer into just a solo cup, and we're going to be taking the strained resin and putting it back in the bottle because we're still good to use it. Make sure that you put it back in the same bottle and don't, mix resins you don't intend to mix. And then we're going to be using paper towels to just wipe all of the resin up out of the tray. And we're going to have to be pretty thorough about that step because we're going to clear resin and we want it to be clear. So don't want any of this white resin mixed into it. So I'm going to go ahead and put on my respirator and get this done. So it's kind of a weird error with this one. It's like a little air bubble or something that just goes straight through it. So I'm gonna try and fix that here by putting a drop of UV resin on one end of the little channel and then seeing if I can just suck the resin through with a syringe on the other side. Well, it's got it some of the way. Alright, so now that we have used the syringe to suck resin through that little channel, you can't really see it anymore. Alright, time for one of my favorite parts, gemstone work. So we're going to be building up, well, as you can see, we've got our Chitino head, engraved into the gemstone itself through the printing process. So what we're going to be doing here is adding in some colored UV resin to build up the actual presence in the gem. So first we're going to be doing the parts that are black. We're going to be getting a black dye, and just the general process for this we're going to be doing is mixing in a little bit of UV resin and a little bit of dye, and then using a sewing needle like so to just dip the or drip the colored resin into the areas that we want it. So we only need like a drop or two of UV resin here, not much at all. Should be plenty enough. Now for the dye, we want probably less than a drop, so just gonna get a little bit on our pin here, and then we're just gonna mix it up. It's not the easiest to mix with a pin, so go ahead and use a wooden stick. It'll mix it a lot better. So now, being very gently, we're just gonna collect some resin on our little applicator tool here, which for the eyes are a little bit bigger. I'm gonna be using a wooden stick, and we're just gonna touch it to the resin, and with just some surface tension, it'll kind of work on filling up that little gap we have for it. I'm gonna add a little bit more black dye. dyes could be darker, because we are going to build it up. So if your dye isn't strong enough, you'll see some colors shine through it, which can be nice, depending on the look you're going for. Work on spreading the black dyed UV resin throughout the eye. So I couldn't quite get it to go on the pin, but as you can see, we kind of overshot the mouth a little bit. So the nice thing about UV resin is you can definitely clean it up. So we're just going to be dabbing off the excess resin. So I'm not actually touching the resin with the Q-tip. I'm just kind of wiping it right over and letting it kind of suck up the excess resin. So looks like we got just enough to make the mouth noticeable. There's a little bit of spill, but I think that'll be okay. You can only do so much, honestly. Actually, I can always apply more. Let me just try. Yeah, see, if you really try and dab up all the excess, the mouth just disappears. So I'll try and get that back to the way it was. Alright, so once this layer is done, we're going to bake it under our UV light for a couple of minutes. Be sure that whatever spare UV resin you're still working with doesn't get cooked in this process as well. So now we're going to be switching over to a white dye. So if you want to make sure you don't get any of the black dye mixed in with the white dye resin, you can take your applicator tool, wipe it down as much as you want, and then just bake whatever is left on and cure that resin. And then you won't have to worry about any of the black dyes left over being mixed into the new one. But just be sure to wipe off as much of the resin as you can get before you put it under the UV light. Next up, we're going to be filling in our next layer that we want white with some, white dyed resin. So we also want to put some pink in our ears. So we'll go ahead and do that on this layer as well, because we're going to want that dyed before we move on to the following layers that will cover that. So the ears they're not quite pink, they're a little bit more of a salmon, so we're going to mix pink and orange in. Since we want this to be a lighter blue, this one ended up being, like 1 drop of blue and 4 drops of white, but this is a relatively larger area, so we can put a couple drops in there and then spread it out. So hopefully you're noticing, oh shoot, my hand was in the way the whole time. So hopefully you're noticing that kind of the way that you really spread resin around is you kind of push it up to the edges, and then the center will kind of fill in on its own. Once you play around with working with UV resin, you kind of makes sense after a while, but it's fun. And now our final layer of black. So we haven't smoothed out the resin yet, so it's still a little bit cloudy, but you can see our chitini is taking shape. So now we're going to provide the background. This is supposed to be like a sapphire blue gemstone, so we're going to be creating the gemstone itself. So we're going to take some nail polish, and we're just going to be spreading that on the back of the gemstone. Just give that a nice coating. Once you have as much of that applied as you'd like, I'm going to go for a bit of a more like opalescent kind of sapphire look. So I'm going to be mixing up a little concoction here of resin, dye, mica powder, and some mylar flakes. So it's very important with UV resin, you don't mix in too much solid stuff, or else you can kind of block the UV from getting to the cure. So with the mica powder, you might be surprised at how little mica powder we put in here. I'm talking like probably so little you'll like barely even be able to tell it's. It's probably about all we're gonna use. And I don't think I'm even gonna use a full drop of the sapphire blue. We just want kind of like the lightest tint imaginable. Ooh, that's too much. And a full drop of this sapphire blue tint. Shoot, even that fraction of a drop was a little much. Actually, that's not bad. It's probably about the color I was going for, but I'm just going to water it down a little bit. So this part's honestly just play around, have fun. Mix it up until you get what looks like the kind of gemstone look you want to go. We're trying to go for kind of a sapphire look with some shiny bits in it. And I think that's about what we've got here. So I'm gonna go ahead and put a nice light layer. Now we're gonna be doing another very similar layer, except a fair bit darker. I'm also going to use a lighter colored nail polish just to get a bit more of a shine. Now finally, I'm going to give it the final coating of this very reflective dark blue nail polish. And that'll help give it a nice luminescent background. I don't know if luminescent is a real word, but it is now. And then for this final layer, it's just going to be clear resin. Wait, I haven't tried using this like metallic blue nail art yet. Honestly, could have just used this stuff. This looks pretty darn nice. But, you know, as you can see, when you get a nice clear resin coat and you've got that like real high gloss wet layer, it just looks so nice. On my UV pieces, my quote-unquote final cure I do is just leaving them out in the sun for like an hour. It seems to do a much better job than UV lights. So our gemstone's starting to look pretty good, but you're gonna notice that the layer lines from the printing have kind of like created a little bit of a hazy effect on the gemstone. Now we want that crystal clear, we want that wet glossy shine. So I'm gonna show you how to do that without sanding. So what you're first gonna wanna do is using popsicle stick and hot glue, we're gonna create a handle, and we wanna position our handle so that the resin we're about to apply to it filters down to a drop point, which is gonna be this corner here. So we're gonna glue it with a little bit of an angle so that it sticks like so. So now when you've got your popsicle stick on there, make sure you've got a good solid grip. You're not gonna want this to come off or it'll be very annoying. So now we're gonna come back over to our resin printer and we are going to dip this in the clear resin. We're gonna make sure we get a nice even coat on all the sides that we want clear. It's kind of hard to get this side just right. But once we've got a nice even coating of clear resin on our part, we're just going to let it drip dry over the resin chamber for 10 minutes. Once your part has had enough time for the resin to drain down to a single point, give it a good look. It should look nice and crystal clear. We're just going to be using a paper towel to clean up that drip off of the tip so that we retain our nice point. And now that everything looks all good and nice and clear, I'm going to hit it with a UV light. When everything looks all good and nice and clear, just bake that on. And then you're left with a nice, clear, glossy, smooth coat. I probably could have let it drip a little bit longer. It still looks a little wet, but you can still see the gemstone cuts. So I think this is great. I'm happy with it, but keep in mind that it's probably still a little tacky right now, so if I were to touch it, it would ruin it. So make sure that you let this thing sit in front of some UV lights and like fully cure really, really good before you try and handle it. I thought I hit record on my camera when I did this, but apparently not. So anyway, the process here was to just put a big old blob of hot glue on this end of the splint, and then as I stuck the arm on the main body how I wanted it, just making sure the arm got stuck in the hot glue, and then held the arm affixed to the main body how I wanted it until the hot glue cooled off enough. Once the hot glue cooled off for a few minutes, I could let go. And now I've got this nice splint holding the hot glue, sorry, the nice hot glue popsicle stick splint holding the arm affixed to the body. And now we can just leave it like this until the epoxy cures. I'm gonna give it at least 24 hours. But you'll also see that there's a little bit of epoxy blob. I wanna clean that off so that it's nice and smooth. Before you do that, make sure that your hot glue is fully cooled. Now since our splint is fully cooled, I can take like a nail polisher thing and just wipe off the excess epoxy so that we get a nice smooth cure without any bumps. And now this little hot glue popsicle stick splint will hold it in place until the epoxy is cured. I'll give it at least 24 hours. If you do this method, make sure that your hot glue is going to be far enough away from where you're gluing that you don't get any epoxy on your hot glue mix. That's going to make it a pain to get off without breaking it again. Just so you know. To get the little hot glue popsicle stick splint off, just going to have to heat up the hot glue, and you do that with a hairdryer. And once you've heated the glue up enough, it just pop right off really easily. Resin can get a little pliable when it gets heated up too, so I would recommend letting it fully cool before you start messing around with it. And do the same to remove the popsicle stick from the chitini gem. I want to get the chitini gemstone in the center part here, so I'm going to be removing our supports. And to do this, I'm just going to grab some little, I don't know what to call these, but just going to snip it right out. And we're just going to try and clean these up, get it as close to the thing as you can. Just be careful because it's a very thin coating, the gold kind of color on there. So if you start like cutting into it or sanding it, you will see the bare resin. Like I mentioned, you can file it, but do be careful. You really don't want to cut into your gold coat. You can test fit the gemstone. You'll see we'll have to really cut and file down. those two little nubs there. Which will probably just take me a little bit of time and finesse, but I'm just going to be trimming away at it with these nippers and filing away at it with my diamond file until they're nice and flat. So I'm not sure exactly how to describe the process that I did for figuring out the pattern for the jabot part. Maybe it could be considered draping, but I pretty much took some paper, folded it up, cut it down, held it up to the collar, just kind of whittled away at it with some scissors, and increasing it until it looked about how I wanted to do it. It wasn't mathematical. It wasn't like really a fully fleshed out process. It was pretty freeform. Just kind of did it. But eventually, you know, I got it down to what I thought would look pretty good. It's not perfectly accurate to Raora's design, but to get Raora's design just right, I would have to make this a lot more complicated and cut in darts and all that kind of stuff. And I just don't want to do that, if I'm being honest. So I think this looks pretty good. So I ended up with a pattern here. And now we're just going to remake this out of some lace. So while cutting out the lace, I'm going to make sure I grab this scalloped edge. This is kind of the main reason I wanted to use this lace. Okay, I'm gonna lay out the pattern like so, and cut it out, but my camera's in the way, and I want to make sure I get this cut right, so I won't film it. Well, we need to finish the edge of our cut lace. I want to do a rolled hem on my serger. However, lace is a bit too delicate to really run through a serger, but what you can do for that is cut a strip of stabilizer. Depending on your purpose, you can use, you know, sew-in or water-soluble. I'm going to be using a water-soluble one because I don't want this to be permanent, so I'm going to cut the stabilizer about the size. And then I'm just going to sew the stabilizer along with it. I typically put the stabilizer on top of the fabric because the feed dogs will pull the fabric through. Normally I encounter stretching when the fabric is up against the presser foot, because the presser foot will kind of like, you know, give it a little bit of friction and stretch it out as it goes. So now it's time to sew it. I'll be making sure to cut into the fabric and the stabilizer as I give it a rolled hem to make sure that it really locks everything down. So if you're watching this video, you're clearly most likely on the internet. If you're curious about, you know, a serger rolled hem, you can go ahead and search that. This is kind of beyond the scope of this video to show you some of the more... For these videos, I'm really more interested in showing you kind of like what you'll need to know when to do the steps to make things. So for some of the more intricate nitty-gritty steps, like exactly what a serger rolled hem is, and how to do one, it's probably best for, you know, you to write that down, take a note, and search for it later. But to finish off pretty much any serged seam, what you can do is take a fatter needle. Sorry, this rolled hem came out a little tight. It was kind of hard to see the threads for me to fish my needle under, you know, while filming through the camera. So you use a thicker needle so that you can get your rolled hem chain through the eye of the needle, and you'll just work that back under your rolled hem. Then you can take the extra thread tail and snip it off. And then that's how you would finish the rolled hem. I'm gonna leave the top tails because we're gonna serge those, so we don't need to do anything with them right now. Alright, so now that we've got both of the side raw edges rolled, stabilized, and the ends, the tails tucked into the seams. We're going to leave the tails on the top part and work about getting this nice fold that we want. So to do that, basically going to fold up our lace the same way we've got our pattern folded up, and then run another rolled hem along the top, and that should hold it all together. To do that, I'm going to need it nice and stable. So I'm going to take stabilizer and cut it out with the pattern. Use the pattern to cut the stabilizer and not necessarily the fabric, because this is going to hold it together. I'm going to cut a little bit away from the pattern. Need some extra meat to work with. And that looks about close enough. We're gonna try and find which side is the top. Looks like I'm kind of going by like these little puffs in the lace are coming out to this side. I'm gonna determine that as the back. So if that's the back, then we're gonna kind of fold it like this. I'm gonna kind of match these in more or less the middle. Oh, shoot. Yeah, I also want to trim back the wash away stabilizer. The less of that we have to rinse off, the better. But we'll deal with that in the next step. When you do this part, be very careful not to cut your lace. So I'm gonna try and kind of like get this on more or less of the halfway point. This is going to be done by hand, so it's not going to be perfect. I have started to find that to be kind of like the charm of the things I make, since they're handmade. Not everything is quite at exactly the right angle or exactly the right spacing. I don't know, I think there's kind of a charm to just being, you know, as good as I can get it with my own hands and eyes. But obviously I can't exactly match a computer in a lot of cases. So we have that kind of fold that we want. And I want to go by this side into the serger first. You can press it if you want. I'm not going to. I think having it a little bit kind of puffy will add to the look, but I am going to pin it. Make sure it doesn't, hopefully doesn't shift around much while I'm serging it, but if you do pin it, be sure that you pin it far enough down that it's not, the pins aren't going to get in the way of your serger. There we go. Now we can put this through the serger and you just kind of have to guide it through the curve as you go. I'm going to cut into it a little bit to make sure we get a nice edge. So if you're wondering why I'm feeding this side into the serger first, that's because I find that anything closer to a 90-degree angle just feeds into the serger better. So I would always recommend going for whatever gets you that cleanest angle, and this pin isn't quite. There we go. I'm gonna have my serger so that the knife is up, and then you lifting up the foot. I like to place this as far under it as I can get it. Now I'm gonna try and be very gentle with this part. Make sure I get this curve well. Alright, I think that did a pretty good job of capturing the curve. Now, I'll do that for the other side, but make sure that they're mirrored. Removing the water-soluble stabilizer should be pretty easy. You can pretty much just get it wet. And then it'll just kind of work it out. Might need to soak for a minute, but just kind of be gentle and just work the stabilizer out. On to the final step, attaching our lace jabots. I'm using some tape here I applied to kind of keep the resin in check while I used some XTC 3D to glue the Chitini gemstone into the collar, necklace, whatever this thing's supposed to be called. So, what we're going to be doing here is gluing down the jabot to the necklace. And to do that, I'm going to kind of mark down about where we're going to be sticking it. Notice the marker isn't staying on there super well. That's fine for our purposes. We just need something temporary to hold us over while we apply contact cement. Now, this kind of surprises people that I use this DAP Weldwood contact cement because it's supposed to be for like woodworking projects, but it just works so darn good on fabric, foam, and combining all that kind of stuff, especially to resin. So this stuff is, in my opinion, baller coated with the sauce. Skibbity Riz, Ohio. I don't know what kids are saying anymore or what any of that means, but not going to be using the brush. I'm going to be using like a nail art little foam thing here. So we're just going to apply a little bit of this contact cement on the resin where we're going to be sticking on the rolled hem portion of our little lace jabot parts. To apply a little bit of contact cement along the rolled hem of the lace bits, just get it nice little bit of saturation. You want to make sure you get the edges because those will be what peels up the easiest. Once you've got your contact cement applied, whatever contact cement you're using should tell you how long to let it sit before you press them together. Mine says 15 minutes to 2 hours, so I'm gonna let this sit a good 15-20 minutes. And contact cement does bond immediately on contact, so make sure everything is aligned when we press these down. There are no do-overs. The point of no return. Alright. And there's one side done. Sure. Really press it in there. Get a good contact between the cements. Try and get these to lay as evenly as can be. Well, I should say symmetrically, actually. our jabot is attached. So if you plan on making one of these yourself using my model, note that the collar arms are not a one-size-fits-all, and they are sized to me. So what you can do anyway to make something that fits you, if you don't want to 3D model new arms or just my models, is something like I did on this birch here, where instead of, because there's 3 parts here for printing it. There's kind of the main body, and then there's each arm. You can just not print the arm, process the main body as we've talked about in this video, and then you can add one of these pins here and elastic arms. And then what this will do is this can pin the front of your shirt, and then this goes around the neck and the back of the collar, and it will clip in, and that will hold it nice on the front of your shirt. And you can just attach it to the back of the gemstone or whatnot. And since this typically goes under a collar, especially if you're doing it for Raora's cosplay, the collar will cover up probably about to here or so anyway, so you wouldn't even know that there are no arms. So, alternative way to make it is to not use the arms and just use a pin and some elastic to hold it on the neckline. And here is the final piece being worn. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my channel, as I like to do a variety of cosplay crafting projects and video document as much of them as I can. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope you take care.